Hey guys, don't know what happened when I made this video the other night for y'all. Just didn't upload to YouTube. Hopefully this one will do that. So obviously if you're hearing me, it worked and it's uploaded. So we're going to go through the evolution of populations. Up until now we've just been talking generally about evolution, generally about Darwin, generally about the evidence that points to the existence of the theory of evolution. We're going to start talking about actual changes in populations and how that affects a species over a period of time. So here we go. So as you know, we never really say that an individual evolves. Evolution doesn't happen on an individual, one-by-one organism per population basis. It happens instead on an entire group of organisms, an entire species or entire population. So we say that natural selection acts on individuals, whereas evolution acts on populations. Natural selection is going to result in two things. We're going to have differential survival, meaning not everyone's going to survive. That's where our whole survival of the fittest thing comes in. You survive long enough to pass on your genes if you have some kind of advantage, if you innately have some kind of advantage that allows you to survive best in that current situation or current environment. So along with differential survival, we also have what we call differential reproductive success. Not everyone's going to be able to have offspring. Not all of those offspring are going to live long enough to have offspring of their own. It kind of goes with the whole thing that the more children you have, the better your chances that those children will be successful and those genes will be passed on, the population will continue to grow. So over time, the genetic makeup of a population changes. It does so in direct response to the environment that that population lives in. So there's no true most fit condition. Your fitness depends on your environmental conditions, and that alters all the time. Sometimes an environment will stay stable for 200 years and no one really changes a whole lot. And other times an environment changes every 10 years and we'll see a genetic change as a reflection of that upheaval in the environment. The more favorable the traits you inherit, the greater fitness you have, and the more common those traits become, because those are the organisms that are successfully reproducing and passing on those traits, which allow their offspring in turn to survive. So you go from having just a few organisms with that trait who are successful to tons and tons of organisms with that trait who are also successful. Okay, this picture isn't very good on the video, but it should be fairly okay on your slide. I'll let you read through that by yourself. Okay, so like we said, individuals either survive or they don't, and they either reproduce or they don't. So natural selection acts on individuals, but evolution itself acts on populations. Okay, so one of the things that you have to be able to do is interpret graphs. So we're going to take a fairly long time on this particular slide looking over these graphs that I have for you. This organism is called a female water strider. They live in water, hence the name. And the graphs represent different situations that these bugs can be found in. So let's go through it. Now all these graphs are pretty much showing the same thing. They're showing the ability of this female to survive and reproduce. In other words, the ability of the female to be fit for her environment. So this first graph, hold on, let me switch to my laser. This first graph right here shows the length of the female water strider versus the number of eggs she can lay per day. You would notice the longer she gets, the more eggs she lays. So this suggests that to be fit for this environment, this female water strider needs to be a pretty big organism, at least big for her particular species. Let's go down and look at this second graph down here. This one shows the number of eggs laid during her entire lifetime versus, versus the length of the female water strider. So this one shows a little bit different of a difference. This top graph just showed for one day, whereas this shows for an entire lifetime. And you'll notice that as she gets bigger, she tends to lay less and less eggs. Her optimum size seems to be about 14 millimeters, because that's where she is fairly big and still laying a decent amount of eggs, over her lifespan. Keep in mind that these organisms don't live for very long. We're thinking 2 or 3 months might be her maximum. Okay, let's look at this third graph over here. Again, it shows the lifespan of the adult female water strider. And again, we're comparing it to her length. The longer she gets, the less days she lives. Okay, so if we summed it all together, initially we might think that being really big would be a good thing. But by looking at all three graphs, we realize that it's not a good thing. The bigger she is, the less long her life is, or the less length her life has, which means she can't produce as many eggs over time because she doesn't exist for a very long time anymore. Then again, the bigger she is, the less eggs she lays over her entire lifespan. Even if she lives for a little bit longer, she's still laying less and less eggs. So what this shows us is that for this particular scenario, being most fit would be being about medium size and therefore laying a decent amount of eggs, living for a decent amount of time. Okay, so we've talked about variation before. We know that variation are all our differences, the things that make you different from me and vice versa. It is the raw material for natural selection. Natural selection would not work if everyone had all of the same traits and behaved the exact same way every single minute of every single day. For natural selection to be successful, for you to be able to weed anything out, you need to have differences within a population. Those differences are going to create the situation where some of the organisms are going to be more fit and others will be less fit. Okay, so where does variation come from? It comes in the form of mutations. Mutations can happen in two places. During mitosis or meiosis, when we're making those body cells or those gametes. And it can also happen because of environmental damage. So UV sunlight or free radicals or chemicals getting into your DNA and disrupting it. Because remember, mutation is a random change to your DNA. Once those bases aren't in the sequence they need to be in, you just had a mutation. The other way variation comes in is through sexual reproduction. Don't forget, your mom and dad have different alleles. Again, an allele is a version of a gene. So mom has one version, dad has one version, and because sexual reproduction and how those alleles come together is a random process, everyone kind of ends up with something a little bit different, which is why you and your brother and your sister can all have the same mom and dad, but the three of you don't look exactly like mom or dad, and the three of you don't look exactly like either of the siblings. Okay, there's always going to be variation because you're having new combinations of those genes. Those genes are coming together in a brand new way nearly every single time sexual reproduction ends in the production of an offspring. New combinations are going to give rise to new phenotypes. New phenotypes either allow you to survive in your environmental situation, location, whatever, or they don't allow you to survive. Because the offspring made are inheriting those traits directly from their parents, these are the same types of traits that they themselves will be able to pass on. Again, they're going to have the same allele situation, but they're going to pass on the same ultimate type of trait. Either you're quicker, you have good camouflage, you are poisonous, whatever it is that allows you to survive. So there are 5 ways that evolution takes place, or 5 ways that evolutionary change happens. This is what you need to be writing down. So the first way is mutation, then there's gene flow, non-random mating, genetic drift, and selection. So we're going to step through each of these right now. Okay, so mutation and variation we've just talked about. Mutation creates differences, and it happens all the time. Now, why would a change in my DNA sequence be such a big deal? Don't forget, your DNA codes for your amino acids. Your amino acids, in turn, code for your proteins. Your proteins are the macromolecules that do the majority of work in your body. Everything from building to expressing to everything that your body does, a protein is somewhere behind that. It's somewhere in the mix. Now, when we change up the way our proteins are supposed to look and function, then we do exactly that. We change their structure, we change their function. You will learn that when it comes to macromolecules, and in biology in general, structure and function go hand in hand. You change the structure, most times you change the function. And changing the function is not always a good thing. Okay, gene flow. This is kind of like the immigration-emigration thing we talked about before. Gene flow is a movement of individuals and their alleles in and out of populations. So, for example, when I left Grenada, I took my alleles with me. Right now, my alleles are nowhere in Grenada. The only way they would go back to Grenada is if I went back to Grenada. So whenever people, even change towns, we have allele shifting taking place, or we have gene flow taking place. We are taking alleles or genes out of one area and moving them to another. In some cases, it's, the genes are going in or the genes are coming out. So what we have developing, especially in the human population, is a genetic mixing across the different regions of our world. So it really is reducing the differences between our individual populations. The human race is divided into three main populations. Everyone can find their origin out of these three main groups: Caucasian, Negroid, and Mongoloid. By having a lot more interaction with people who are not necessarily originally from the place you are from, we are blending all of these regions and all of their distinctiveness together. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not necessarily a good thing either. Okay, so especially in the human world, like I said before, gene flow is always on the rise. Every time you jump on a plane or a train or a boat or a car or whatever, you're moving your genes around. So ultimately, we're getting to the point where we may not have as many distinctive differences between the races as we used to. My family being a really good example of that. We don't really understand the whole race thing. We just know we love you or we don't. Okay, the next one is called non-random mating. Just like the name suggests, mating is not a random process. So it's not like, oh, whoever next walks through the door, that's going to be my baby daddy. No. You're looking for very specific clues. And in this case, it's the female that's making all of the decisions. They're looking for visual clues. And those clues need to show I am stronger, I am bigger, I am healthier. Pretty much I am vital. And I can produce offspring that will survive. If you are a male and you don't have these visual clues, then no one mates with you because no one really wants you. So here are some examples. One of the classic ones being the mane of the African lion. Females are looking for a really big, healthy, thick mane, lots and lots of hair, and lots of dark coloration, just like this guy is showing. This exhibits the fact that he's really, really strong, really, really dominant, and really healthy. Some other examples would be this guy right here. This is called a frigate bird. Normally, this red section of his throat isn't inflated. It kind of hangs down kind of like the wattle on a turkey. But this is how he attracts his mate. The mate's looking for a couple of things. First of all, how big is your throat pouch? The bigger the throat pouch, the better. And it's also looking for that bright red color. If it's like a lighter pink color, then that kind of tells the female frigate bird, you're not so healthy, chum. I'm probably not going to mate with you. If you are a reindeer or elk or any member of that family, sorry guys, the females are looking at your antlers and how many branching points it has, how big it is, that kind of thing. Down here, this is a prairie. I want to say they're prairie chickens, but I could be very wrong on that. Anyway, their whole thing is color. You'd notice that closer to the top of the male's head, he has all these pretty red feathers and blue and emerald green feathers. So the more vital and bright and vibrant your colors are, the more healthy you are. This picture over here would have been a peacock. You should be able to see it on your slide. Of course, you're not seeing it on my video. I'm sorry about that. And we all know the whole thing with the peacock and his tail feathers, sorry. Okay, genetic drift. Now don't mix up gene flow and genetic drift. Gene flow is I am willingly moving away and taking my genes with me. Genetic drift is all due to chance events. And there are two main kinds of genetic drift. The first one is called founder effect, and the second one is called the bottleneck effect. We're about to step through those in more detail. Okay, so founder effect happens when a new population is started by only a few individuals. So for some reason, a small group of people, like our pilgrims, for example, or a small group of birds, like the finches, for example, break off from their main population and colonate someplace else. The situation that's created here is you're changing your gene pool. What you're actually doing is skewing your gene pool because you're changing the frequency, the rate at which we see certain genes. So in a large population, some of our rarer alleles that potentially cause diseases or potentially cause just a different kind of phenotype will be all scattered throughout the population. The chances of two people with both of those rare alleles meeting and mating is a lot reduced just because of sheer numbers. But in founder's effect, some of those rare alleles become high frequency because you only have a small population and you have two people that have both of these rare alleles that cause, let's say, polydactyly, for example. And that's an actual true case. The Amish people have way more cases of polydactyly than any other population in the world. Polydactyly is what happens when you grow more than 5 fingers or toes per limb. And the reason is because 2 of their founding members had the gene for polydactyly. Well, when you are only part of a small population, your options for mates are very, very reduced. So you kind of mate with whoever best suits you out of the tiny little population that you have. And those genes present themselves, and those offspring get those genes, and then they mate, and it just keeps going. So per capita, the Amish population has way more members with several fingers and toes than the normal human population. Colonization, which happened years and years ago before any of us were born, is a really good way to study founder's effect. And the way that modern scientists do it is by looking at blood type. So on this map, I'm showing you where original blood types existed, and now we can kind of look everywhere and see where they exist currently. So when we're talking about O blood type, the native populations of the world, like where they originally were found, would have been mostly South America and Central America. That's where we see the highest rates of O blood. But now look at where else we find O blood. We find O blood up at the northern, like Alaska and northern Canada, and all through the whole California, New Mexico, that whole region there, parts of Florida, throughout the Caribbean. And that shows us where different groups split off from their original population and migrated and started colonies. Here's another example showing B-type blood. Again, B-type originated in Europe and Asia, but now it's kind of everywhere. But you can tell that it's not as prevalent everywhere else. This was the native spots that people with B blood type were found in, but now they're found throughout the world. Same thing with the O blood chart. Okay, and another thing we can look at is migration of humans out of Africa. You should know that the human population originated in Africa and then just kind of moved around from there. That's the ultimate example of founder's effect. Okay, the other kind of genetic drift is called bottleneck effect. And in bottleneck effect, you had a large existing population that was drastically reduced, so the numbers were reduced by some sort of disaster. That could have been a famine, a hurricane, an earthquake, loss of habitat, increased poaching, some kind of disease, anything that would take out the majority of members of that population would lead to what we call a bottleneck effect. Now, what happens is we lose certain alleles from the gene pool. With Founder's effect, we're skewing the gene pool because we're throwing in rare alleles at a much higher frequency. With bottleneck effect, we are completely eliminating certain genes from the gene pool because all of those organisms with those genes died. Okay? So the way it works is you have a large population. The population gets reduced to just a few individuals, and those few individuals manage to bring that population back. So they mate with each other and mate with each other and mate with each other until the population numbers are back up again. So the species itself doesn't die out. But what happens is the gene pool got narrowed because some genes were lost forever. A good example of an organism that's gone through bottleneck effect several times over actually is the cheetah. You can think of it as all of the cheetahs in existence today are kind of like identical twins. There is less than 1% diversity. They're all pretty much genetically the same organism. So it means that anything that affects one is going to affect the entire population in almost the same way. Cheetahs actually went through two bottlenecks about 10,000 years ago when we had the Ice Age. A whole bunch of things died, not just the cheetahs, but a lot of organisms died. And then within the last 100 to 120 years, they've gone through a second bottleneck, this one being even more devastating than the first. And that's due wholly and solely to humans. We poach them because some woman thinks that their fur is cute and she wants to have a jacket out of it. Or we cut down the savanna that they live in because we need to grow more crops. Bottleneck is not just affecting the cheetahs, it's affecting a lot of different organisms, like peregrine falcon, for example, golden lion tamarins, which are really cool organisms, and of course our friend the giant panda, who a bunch of you just think is lazy, even though we know that's not entirely true. It is creating a really big deal for conservation biologists because we are literally losing fit alleles out of a gene pool. So that results in a reduction in variation, not a whole lot of changes and differences, and that results in the population itself not being able to adapt. The way that conservation biologists are dealing with it is by starting breeding programs in zoos, but it's not necessarily going well for every species. Some do better than others. The giant panda, for example, doesn't breed well in captivity. We've had a couple of babies in the last 5 or 7 years. Most of them have died before they were a year old. Okay, natural selection. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the peppered moth situation or story. We'll do a simulation of it in class coming up pretty soon. But you are familiar with natural selection. It's differential survival and reproduction due to changes in environmental conditions. So your environment changes. Do you have the alleles that give you a trait and a phenotype that allow you to adapt? If you do, you live long enough to have offspring of your own, pass on those traits to those offspring who in turn carry it on. If you don't have that innate trait, then you die. Okay, so again, 5 agents of evolutionary change: mutation, gene flow, non-random mating, genetic drift, and selection. All right, guys, I will see you when? Tuesday? Yeah, I'll see you all on Tuesday. Bye.